three terrific speakers. So we have the Tax Office, we have the Department of Human Services in Canberra, and we have the New South Wales Health Department. Not quite sure we could have picked anyone probably bigger than you three all put together. I mean, the agencies is what I mean, obviously.
We have put on a little weight.
Yeah, exactly. That was no personal reflection at all. But it's, I mean, really big agencies who are grappling with some big issues around the way in which data starts to inform some of these conversations. Starting on my left, Cheryl-Lea Field is currently the Deputy Commissioner for Debt in the ATO, which strikes me as being quite a gig. And also, indeed, a growth industry, sad to say, involved in reinventing the Australian Tax Office, and has been involved in this conversation, and is also chair of the ATO, Behavioural Economics Steering Committee, so probably knows a little bit about this conversation. So we'll get Cheryl-Lea to lead off in just a moment. Tam Shepherd to my right, good friend and former colleague, in fact, in Cisco, and about 110 years ago, is currently, make sure I get this right, the General Manager for Digital Transformation at the Department of Human Services. Bear in mind, for those of you who are Australian, that means Centrelink, Medicare and pretty much everything else. So it's a reasonably interesting job and reasonably substantive. Big background in health informatics and e-health, both in Canberra and in Queensland, and as I say, also a stint with Cisco. And Kerry Chant, Dr. Kerry Chant, it actually says here Deputy Director General, but we don't have those in New South Wales anymore. We got rid of those and we've instead got Deputy Secretaries of New South Wales Health for general population and public health, and is therefore the Chief Health Officer of this state, a long background in the health space. So we've got some fantastic perspectives, I think, to share, and I think let's get them out. And then basically at that point, it's going to be pretty much where you'd like to take the conversation, either across some of the themes that you're going to hear, or individually we can dive a little bit deeper and see how we go, and we'll take it from there. So, Cheryl-Lea, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay, all right, let's push the clicker, and look at that.
We think we've got the clicker thing, so we'll see.
Okay, I thought I'd start with some really big figures and numbers, and you might get the impression that we've actually got we have billions of dollars that go through every day. And one of the interesting things when I first started in debt, it was talking about, what my debt book is, and it's, several $1 billion, and sort of think about that and it blows your mind. But when you look at how do we actually positively influence people to willingly participate in the tax system, you start to look at how do you address that. And I think right up front, we should actually say that 85% of people lodge on time, and another 5%, a little bit later, and the same with paying. So the vast majority of people actually do the right thing and work through the process and are able to participate actively in the tax system. So that's sort of a bit of a preference, a context that we need to think about. But what I'd like to cover in my presentation, rather than telling you all about debt, is in relation to how we used originally what we called behavioural economics, and then we started to move towards, really it's about the insights on what we have learnt as an organisation. We started back in 2010, and we started with a process that we were looking at how the behavioural economics would help us with our data. We're now sort of moving where the data is actually enhancing our behavioural insights into what we should be doing next, and sort of changing that frame. And particularly we've probably progressed, as I would say, to become much more sophisticated in the way that we use our analytics. We started off looking at compliance, and we had a compliance pyramid, interestingly, around, you help people at the bottom and then you go to the pointy end, and it was based on health, actually, and the work done by the Braithwaites at the ANU. But we started to look then around people's propensity and capacity to pay in debt as a predictive analytical model. And we've now developed in partnership with UTS in relation to a self-finaliser model. And we're running over our data now those that will eventually self-finalise their debts. And we're just developing in partnership those that will self-finalise lodgement. So we can better target our activities around what should we do for the rest. Because we have this hypothesis or hunch now that if you actually start harassing people that are actually doing the right thing, you might have the reverse effect on them. So we've used that data to help us start to look at really what's the natural system that people are operating in, and how do we actually re-engage people back into that system. So let me take you on a very potted history. Phase 1. We actually started with debt letters. We had a conversation with the fledgling unit in the UK, and we said, OK, let's go. And we'll trial the same things. And not surprisingly, we actually had some positive results. But what that did is to say, well, what is our current state? So it was really important to have a benchmark. What is your baseline approach? We looked at the fact that growth in our debt books was growing. We realised that we wanted to better understand what are the segments, who are the people that are growing in debt, and we wanted to be able to evaluate our outcomes. It was surprising that when we started to read our letters, we found one of our most common letters said, "Please ignore this letter," in the very first opening line. And most people did. You can see them on my very last slide. But the other is around that we started with things like, we're focusing more attention on your case. We built around most people pay their taxes on time, the usual things that you can read. But it was important we had a randomised trial. We had 1,000 people in the pilot, 1,000 in the control, and then you actually can evaluate your results. And I think because this is a data session, we'll talk more about that rather than the design. So you saw an increase in 4.3% in payment arrangements, 6.8% increase in full or partial payments, and the others is in there. So people actually started paying because we actually changed the letter, not only the words, but it looked a little bit more like a bill. The second phase is, all right, well, building on that success, and I poached Paul Crusp from debt and brought him into lodgement when I was in lodgement, and we said, well, OK, we can change our letters, but let's look more broadly around how do we affect a whole segment. We have tax practitioners that lodge 75% of individual returns, 90+% of businesses' returns, but we were seeing that progressively tax returns were being lodged later and later, and appeared to be a large percentage of people that weren't lodging at all. So from my philosophy, we went out and we co-designed with the tax practitioners. So we started to work with them and realised that this is actually transforming a whole segment. So you couldn't do it overnight. You could go out and say, all of you need to lodge by 85% on time or else. And we realised the else wasn't much. The only thing we could really do is sort of go to the tax practitioners board, which was in its fledgling period, and say deregister them because they're not lodging on time. And that out of all of the criteria is not the case. So we actually developed in the first year what was the premise and built a social norm around actually most tax practitioners actually lodge on time, rather than what the sitting message is, the world is ending as we know it and hardly anyone's lodging on time. But we had to use data to find that. So we had to go through and look at the different types of tax practitioners, group them in because they said, oh, all the large end are lodging on time, the small practitioners are struggling, all of those sorts of things. So it was important to go back and prove that data. Not only did we prove the data, we actually then developed a letter that in the trial year, we said, this is our trial year, we'll send you out material about your performance, so we'll help you get to the end of this year before we even start measuring. And we also then addressed some of the issues around a lodgement of a zero return was a lodgement. If you couldn't lodge it electronically, because we were also channel shifting, if you couldn't lodge it electronically, we wouldn't expect you to lodge electronically, because they were the sorts of, in these sort of forums here, people would say to you, Cheryl-Lea, there's no way I can lodge this return because you don't have an electronic channel. And I said, well, why would I make you lodge it electronically then? It's impossible. That had a huge impact in the second year, where we saw, nearly over 400,000 additional returns lodged on time. We had a 32% increase across the board of tax agents, but it was really important to first co-design, have your baseline data, dispel the myths, and then give them ongoing feedback. And you can see at the bottom of the slide there, that was our first use of colour, where we inserted getting colour out in a letter in a large bureaucracy. I assume everyone else knows how difficult that is. But you can see that it said, here's your practice's performance and here's a practice like you. And so people were surprised. And we had a different message in each of the letters. We said, thank you to the guys. You're doing really well if you're above. If you're close, you're getting there, we'll help you out. If those that were more difficult, we actually had some personal treatment that we did. And I started to tell stories about, one tax agent that would take 300 years to lodge all of his clients' returns and he would never catch up. So you start to get those different messages. The third phase is, okay, we trialled a whole of segment, we went into debt. Let's look at the whole system of letters that we're using to lodge. And you can see the different colour processes we use there. But again, data. So we thought, let's pick those taxpayers that are long-term non-lodgers. We've sent every other letter possible to them and they haven't lodged. And then we measured the performance. And so again, in going through your data, it's important to identify it. And we saw a significant improvement. And so we could say that trial was a success because while we in the tax office have been using this behavioural work since 2010, we were actually nudging our own organisations and the broader community that these things weren't bad because they were different. Because, sometimes people have an adverse reaction initially. The current phase we're in is moving from probably predictive analytics, which I talked about, the capacity to pay or the propensity to pay, where we've got models, we've looked at people's individual performance, is now in looking at things like people who are self-finalisers. Our next strategy is a whole of client. Let's look at the end-to-end. So we've looked at all of our debt details and said, who is the fastest growing segment? What's the types and characteristics of those individuals? So small business is a large percentage of our collectible tax debt. So we've said, well, within there, is there any areas, and Cameron's helped do this detail for me who's in the audience, and we said, okay, sole traders are twice as more likely to go into debt. So what's that trigger that happens there? And then if you're in the construction industry, you're 3 times more likely to go into debt. And so you start to unpack what are the sorts of processes that individual goes through within those markets, and are we actually making it easier for them to comply? So the data, the big data, is helping us then design strategies that we can use from an end-to-end process. And what are the triggers that might mean that we tailor our right treatment at the right time? Is that for some taxpayers we've seen that missing just one activity statement means that they're 4 times more likely to end up in debt. So the challenge over the next year or so is that we're developing what we call micro campaigns. Rather than the big engine pumping out, the same letters to everybody, is to use different techniques. But again, with the data is to have your baseline, your control group, and then see what the impact is. And also what this data enables us to do is to go out and partner with, small business departments, with industry and others, because we don't know the answers to everything. And I think you got that from that last panel, is that the worst thing we can do is we think we've got the solution. So using that data, it helps you go out and have a conversation. And I can't remember who said it, it's really empowering that if you actually give data back to people themselves, they can actually help them better manage the outcome. So I know I've probably gone over the time, but that's sort of the phase. And you can see just on the better, our original letter was on the left. Our first attempt for a letter was putting a box in more plain English. Then we went colour, and now we're out of control with colour. But that's not my major letters. And if anyone who's got a debt here may still get, I found the other day, please ignore this letter, and had my name on the bottom of it. So I'm now reading every letter we send out. And we're getting a program, and we've actually got some people who are skilled in helping us together with our organisational psychologists to rewrite our letters. It's part of our reinventing the ATO.
No, I think you can hold on to that. We've been given a whole different clicker on this side of the equation. That's fantastic. So ATO, let's head to DHS. Look at that. Fantastic. Yeah.
Can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and thank them for the beautiful land we stand on today, acknowledge their ancestors past and present, and sorry business in the area at this time. It's interesting to take from Cheryl-Lea's last point about the engagement of the psychs. Some of ours are in the room, and the first point I'd make about DHS is we couldn't have done this by ourselves, and there are experts in this room from the CSIRO. There are other colleagues in this room who we talk to regularly from universities like QUT, and that collaboration has been really critical. We've started our behaviour economics program, which is probably 2 or 3 years in now, sort of a two-speed economy. We decided to be very cautious and careful and deeply scientific, but at the same time have a crack. And that's going to sound really bizarre, but I'll walk you through how that's translated. But we actually knew we needed a deep scientific understanding of what we were doing. When you retune a beast like DHS or the ATO, you have to be very particular about how you retune that. You know, you mentioned "Don't call me back." The word "may" in a letter in our organisation nearly melted down all of our national call centres in January. So just a fine change like that can really have big impact. So we've got a bit of a two-speed thing going on. We've done a lot of our bigger scale stuff internally with our own staff, and we have a very good relationship with the CSIRO and some international research which we're about to publish. Numbers, we have a very similar set of numbers to Cheryl-Lea. It's just the opposite end of the yin and yang. They collect it, we spend it. So you'll see yeah, that's right. You'll see the outlays nearly match the money that Cheryl-Lea brings in. In fact, just a little bit more. And we're dealing with that problem right now. But,
oh, damn.
But between the two agencies, we really do front and touch nearly every Australian from a Commonwealth perspective. In terms of who we are, Martin mentioned before, you know us better out in the community of Centrelink and Medicare and child support, but we are actually an agency that delivers services for and on behalf of 27 different agencies, right through to, you know, we now pay end-to-end and through the Department of Immigration from asylum seeker all the way through to permanent resident. Our strategy is pretty simple. There's 20 slide versions of this, but we want you off the phone, out of the office. We don't want paper and we want you online. And because of that, there are a series of analytics that give rise to opportunities, in particular around how we use data to retrain our service delivery. Quick example, we had a program called Students 95 that Cabinet signed off on about a year ago. Whole idea was for the top 5 things students need to do, get them online. We went for 3 or 4 months, maybe even 6 months at a stretch, and we thought, gee, they're not picking this up like we thought they were. You know, we're 62, 63, 64%. What's going on? And this is the difference of real-time analytics. We suddenly found something. People aged 45 to 57 were looking up youth allowance student overnight, after 8 at night. What on earth? Oh my gosh. Parents are still doing this for their kids.
It's an outrage.
And we've spent all of our time running a change management in O Week, focused on students, push notifications on Facebook, every social media technique you could ever invent. We did it and got nowhere. Because actually what mum and dad wanted was a decent note from us to say this is what your child needs to do. So so the big difference was we could see this in real time. We could understand the behaviour of students, if they're still lazy, and go into the real behaviour change that works as tell their parents. So big change for us, because ordinarily in a government program you wait to the end of the 18-month program, go back and evaluate and go, damn, we failed. This is a whole new world to be able to adjust as we go and retune policy. I won't go over the business integrity example because pretty much what Cheryl-Lea outlined is exactly what we've found too. The only thing I would change, and Cheryl-Lea's probably got some other examples in the ATO, is we've done all the letters. Ours are pink. I think that calms you down when you get a letter from Centrelink. But the key thing I would add is all forms of electronic communication. So we're finding increasingly an SMS is just as effective, even more effective than a letter. In fact, a number of cohorts find that more of a personal intrusion than receiving a letter. Channel optimisation is a really interesting one for us. So this is about shifting channels, and the ATO have done a lot of work in this space. We have some very prescribed trials underway, and I think Mark from the CSIRO will tell you probably end of the month we'll be coming out with some of our research in that space. But we have some other projects in that space where we're trying to shift people from the face-to-face services having to ring us into digital channels and into self-serving, and I'll walk you through some of those examples. This is some of the stats about how we're going, in terms of our channel shift. And the bottom line is we've seen a massive uptake in digital, and it's been a tough journey. We've learnt lessons and we've had issues on the way, but we're heading in this direction. The one I love is my favourite. Can you see the mouse with the flames coming off it? I call that the bogan mouse. Because it looks like a Holden panel van to me. But we sent it to everybody who receives a letter from us, and we said, this mouse goes faster than your letterbox. So you should, like 9 out of 10 Australians, elect to get your mail faster. And over the past year and a half, we can see the stat down here, because we gave them where it says 41.7% on electronic messaging. That's letters, SMSs. They've elected to get off paper. Thank you, Bogan Mouse. One of the other things I said is even if you get to our front of house, I don't know who's been in the Centrelink office in the past 10 years, they're busy, they're long queues, We need to get people out of them because lots of the people that are in that Centrelink office can actually do it themselves. So we've got a range of helpful messages based on the research that we've had commissioned over the past 3 years. There's a really clever subliminal one. Here are the footsteps, follow them. They're towards our self-service terminals. You won't slip on them because they've all been OHS approved, and it actually feels like concrete. It's very bizarre when you walk on them. We've got other messages like be first in line every time, because click and it's done. Do it electronically. And if you manage to make your way to a seat which we no longer call the waiting room, we now call it the influence room, you are constantly looking at a picture of someone that's in line versus someone that's online, and someone that's online doesn't sit here, right? And the staff reinforce that. So every 10 minutes they come up and just remind you what you're actually waiting for. You could have done it yourself. Usually after an hour, when they try to just drop a form off, they figure out I can go home and take a picture on my phone and send it to them next time. I don't need to sit in that Centrelink office for an hour. So this is examples of having a crack. We've really gone hard with using these messages, employing the help of Sykes to actually get these messages out into our front of house to try and channel shift some of our traffic. Just the very last one in terms of our design thinking. Cheryl-Lea talked about co-design. That's a pretty advanced Commonwealth program that we actually like to co-design our services now with our customers. We've learnt a lot through this process about how we can completely rethink the design of our front of house services. And the way I describe it, that I think everyone in the room can probably relate to, is this. Do you remember who's a Qantas frequent flyer or a frequent flyer? Yeah. Do you remember when you walked into the airport and your special line was gone and you now saw a kiosk? But what was the feeling? Like, oh crap, I have to do it, right? And what was that I have to do? I have to help myself. And I had to put the bag on the thing and it'll go away. And you were still looking for your line. No, it's gone. Occasionally there was a person who appeared behind a post. Are you stuck? Basically, in the 2 and 5 minute zones in our offices, that's exactly the feeling I want you to have. Because we want you to come in, your first impression should not be, I'm going to sit down and stay here for 7 to 20 minutes and be served. It's going to be, oh no, I have to help myself. So we've got staff at the front door of iPads. They help you help yourself. We've got self-service terminals that will sit you down at if you don't have access to a computer. We're about to have wireless in all of our sites so that you can download things onto your own computers. We have apps on phones, on tablets. We even have app bars in our new sites now to try and help you learn how to help yourself. In fact, you won't get to the 15-minute zone, which is at the back there, until you've done everything humanly possible, including go through the education zone, which is the 10-minute zone, about helping yourself. And just in case you forgot, we've got a rolling looping movie about helping yourself in the 10-minute zone. So we're taking this message around the bringing together of the behavioural side and the economic side, because that costs money, right? When you are served in the 2-minute zone, I can tell you what that transaction costs. That's a very expensive transaction when you sit down for 15 minutes. And we better be serving the people we absolutely need to get to. Not dissimilar to a hospital. You know, a hospital doesn't want to be seeing you for your flus, your coughs and colds. They absolutely want to see you if you've got a life-threatening condition. Hospitals use the same triaging logic, and you'll find the set out of an emergency department. It's pretty similar. But we're taking that knowledge and we're taking that data, analysing it, and the lessons that we've had from our behaviour economics trials and applying them in a front-of-house setting. That's me.
Very good. Excellent. So let's finish off with New South Wales Health. Kerry, all yours.
Okay, I'm going to talk about ending HIV and how we've used data towards the virtual elimination of HIV by 2020. And I want to say that this is a very stretched target, very ambitious. In December...
I think you might have to point it in their direction, in the desk direction, see if the average.
Okay. In December 2012, the Minister launched the HIV testing strategy, and just to understand what we've got to try and do to achieve this, the 3 planks of it are increased in testing. Most people pass on HIV when they don't know that they're carrying the virus, so it's important that people get tested early. It's also important that people get tested early because you have the option of going on to treatment, and now treatments are much more tolerated. Lifespan for people with HIV is approaching that of other chronic diseases. And also, if you're on treatment, it reduces your viral load, so your capacity to pass on the infection is greatly reduced, and this has been demonstrated in a number of randomised clinical trials. So for all those reasons, we want to get people tested, we want to get them tested early in their infection cycle. Treatment, as I said, treatment has an individual benefit to the person, plus also a benefit in reducing the person's infectivity. And so it's a sort of double whammy. In terms of prevention, we want to also maintain safe behaviours, safe sex and safe injecting. Okay, sorry, I need behavioural reprogramming. So how have we used data? We've really used it to influence the behaviour of our service providers and create accountability and healthy competition. Health's got incredibly bright, motivated people who want to do well. We've got innovators within that, and we've got people that are more conservative. And so the data can be used to show people that others have achieved it. So for instance, in one of our central Sydney services, we've seen a 42% increase in testing from a high rate of testing. And whereas other services are still perhaps in the stage going, it's impossible, we've saturated our client group, we can't get any more testing. So putting the data out there challenges people's concepts of what can actually be achieved and promotes service innovation. In December 2012, we were in a situation where the data to inform anything was around 9 months old. So by the following year in 2013, in September, you'd be getting HIV notification data. You wouldn't be knowing anything about your treatment uptake, you wouldn't know about any testing occasions of service, you wouldn't know how many unique patients you'd got through your clinic. So we had an underpinning of particularly databases in our sexual health clinics. We had also introduced a thing called iPharmacy, which is a computerised pharmacy system, and HIV medications are all dispensed because they're S100 drugs through our hospital pharmacy systems. And we also had a pathology system where we could access data around HIV testing rates. But none of that was in time. So we didn't have the right data in the right place to even have the conversation about improvement, or you'd be having it with a lag of a year, which really meant the momentum wasn't there. So I think it picks up on the previous speakers where it's important to have the data at the right time. So now we have a comprehensive quarterly performance monitoring report that was released last Monday for the first quarter of 2014, went out to service providers. And what was fascinating is within an hour of us sending out the data report, we had several questions from our clinician and university stakeholders asking us further questions on sub-analysis of the data within an hour of that report going out. So I think that highlights the fact that it's an engaged sector, it's actually responding to the sector. I think it's also important to understand where the stakeholders you've got are coming from. So clinicians want to provide quality services and they want to do well by their clients. And often the people working in our sector are used to treating very disadvantaged and vulnerable groups. So it's important also to understand and put the quality lens, that you're not mandating that everyone goes on treatment, but what you're doing is showing them the data which shows why does one service have 80% on treatment, why does some person on 90%? There might be reasonable explanations for that, but it is the responsibility of the service director to consider why that would be the case. If an area, we also have data which subsets it by risk groups. So in, for instance, HIV, we want to see very high testing around men who have sex with men. We want to make sure we've got our injecting drug users, high rates of testing. And so we also cut the data by who's getting tested. So again, that highlights the fact that we've got our testing targeted at highest risk groups. Some interesting thing is that we've spent a lot of time, I suppose, inwardly looking in health towards our sexual health services, but 50% of new diagnoses of HIV comes from general practice. So we're now embarking on the fact that we need to engage more broadly with general practitioners about it. And what that's unpacked is the fact that general practitioners themselves struggle with a degree of comfort about broaching sexual health with their clients. And so we're thinking about how do we actually enable that conversation so that it isn't seen that the general practitioner in raising sexual health is sort of almost implying that someone's, you know, whatever they're uncomfortable about. But you can imagine the range of issues that might be occurring in that sort of setting. But we're now really messaging, going to be launching a whole heap of messaging with general practice to up testing, but also a corollary, go out to the community to say that it's actually quality general practitioner when you're going there for your blood pressure check or your pap smear or whatever, that they actually ask you about your sexual health. It's actually something good. It's not that they're making any value judgments about your need for an STI screen. It's actually a good component of holistic care. Also, health practitioners are a bit competitive, and we have a lot of, I think they classify as a type A personalities in health. And so data actually serves a separate role of having competition. So what we'd call is healthy competition. Some competition's unhealthy, but a degree of competition. So a degree of data and the ability to reflect on that data across LHDs is important for us. Local health districts, for people, are our way we organise health. And I suppose as an example, this gives you one example of a data report, but if you go onto the web and look at the New South Wales HIV data report, it's got about 15 pages of all different graphs of data cut in every different way. But overall, we have sophisticated data which shows the performance in how you've gone with testing, treatment and prevention. So overall, we've increased testing by 400, there were around 450,000 tests performed in New South Wales, and we've seen an increase of around 27,000 tests, and we know that the testing's been well targeted. And as I mentioned, overall we've seen a 7% increase in testing, and the reason that's a small level, even though we've seen in our sexual health clinics in the order of 50% increase in testing in some of our major focus initially, which was South Eastern Sydney and Sydney local health districts. That reflects overall general practice, because we've also contacted all the private and public laboratories to get overall HIV testing, because under Medicare there isn't a particular item number for HIV testing, so we can't disconnect it. The other element is that we know that we have to make testing easier. So we know that only around 70% of gay men are getting tested in the frequency or getting HIV tests annually. So there's a real gap, so that's important data to reflect back to our services. So even though you might think you're saturating the market, there's still a lot more. We've got to make it a value proposition for people to get tested. So there's been an introduction of what's called rapid testing, and this is a point of care testing where it takes somewhere in the order of 20 to 30 minutes, and you get a test result. Now, what we've been doing is we've been doing natural experiments of setting these up, and sometimes they're there for awareness raising, so they have another basis of awareness raising, but they also are a service delivery component. And then we look at the characteristics of the populations which goes there. So are we getting people that are very high risk? How many sexual partners have they had in the last month? Are they in the characteristic risk groups? And then we also look at the positivity. So how much of a yield we're getting in terms of positivity. And then we look at different settings of that, both clinic-based settings, community-based settings. So for instance, we've done over 19 sites, but recently during the Mardi Gras we did a pop-up in Oxford Street, and I should say this was like an old shop front. We actually had to make them go to the toilet across the road, and they had very much temporary facility. So again, your construct of what you need to undertake some of this innovating testing needs to be moderated. You don't need a purpose-built facility. Some of the testing's been done in caravans that have been fitted out for testing. And what it highlighted was a 2% positivity, which is very, very high. We identified in the order of 20 cases through the pop-up testing. We're also monitoring the positivity rates across all of our testing sites, and again that feeds back and gives the indication that we still haven't reached saturation. And even in the presence of declining testing rates, we need to message to our clinicians that that's okay, because we need to have sustained rates of high rates of testing whilst we see a decline in hopefully new diagnosis. The data is also a really important process to celebrate success and highlight areas for further work. And it was interesting, during 2013 we probably thought we'd increase testing, but it wasn't until I think the first quarter of this year that we convinced stakeholders to do that. So it's actually really engaging when you've got all your stakeholders, including the non-believers or people that were a bit sceptical, coming on board saying, yeah, we think you probably have really increased testing. And so it can be used as very much a validation that you've got your settings right. So it actually creates an environment that we're all on track to success. And I think the transparency in the data means that it's very open, and I think the response to HIV has always been characterised by strong partnerships with the community groups, and I think this enables this process of having clinicians, academics, and the HIV stakeholders all in the room is really powerful. And together we can make it happen. This is a pop-up caravan example of some of the promotions where we use the point of care testing.
Fantastic. All right, well that's three very, very strong stories. We've got a little bit of time now, obviously, that we can start diving in. There's a couple of kind of invitations I guess I'll throw out, but in the end, obviously, take the conversation where you will. I mean, one will obviously be to pick up any specific story you've just heard, or maybe some threads that you've heard through those presentations, and dive a little deeper. But the other thing I'd encourage you to do is tell, in a sense, your own story. I'm sure there are organisations, public, private, and whatever else in the audience, where you've got kind of data war stories of your own about the kinds of issues that have been raised. So feel free, absolutely, to put them on the table, and who knows, you may get a reaction from across the room as well in terms of some similarities perhaps with what other people are confronting. So the floor is kind of open. It's not terribly structured at this point. It's pretty much where and how you wish to take it.
Can I ask Kerry?
You may, yes, we'll do that to start with.
Hi, Kerry.
Yeah.
Kerry, it's interesting that the story you talked about with doctors and their broader role. We, with tax practitioners, they touch taxpayers more than we do and probably influence them more than we do. But when I talked to them about debt, they went, no, that's not my role. I just lodged their tax return. Sort of, I was hearing similar things. No, they come in around their flu, so I'm not going to ask them about what else they're doing. And it's interesting, until we actually did some research and we asked them through a qualitative and quantitative process, do you think you could influence your clients' debt levels or things like that? And 75% of them said yes, which is the exact opposite of any open forums that I had. And that research I've now used in conversations, and I don't know whether that you've looked at doing that or have done that in your area.
So we have the STIPU, which is linked to Sydney Sexual Health Clinics, done a lot of work with general practitioners about exploring the barriers to sexual health testing in all. And it's interesting that some of the successful interventions are when you link it seamlessly with an episode of, like for a chronic disease check, or you link it so it's almost becomes seamless. So the messaging is, I'm not singling you out, this is just part of good care. So I think some of the formality around the behavioural insights about how we interact can inform that. And we're doing some work with General Practice New South Wales, and it will be interesting to see what the GPs themselves come up with as what will work in their settings, because that's the other thing, that it has to be functional in their settings.
In their context.
In their context.
Yeah, that's good.
Comments, observations? We've got a hand up in the front here. We might just wait for the magic microphone. Sure.
I've got a question that was sparked by Kerry's talk, but it's probably relevant to all of them. And in some ways it's more a question about design than data. How do you avoid, particularly where you're trying to create competition between different segments or stakeholders or what have you, how do you avoid having people just targeting the performance measures that you're using or the outputs rather than actually thinking about delivering outcomes?
Well, I think it's very careful that you've got to be very careful that you're nuanced with the way you use performance data. So I wouldn't say that any level of, for instance, patients on treatment is relevant, but we actually subset the data. There's actually strong evidence that beneath certain CD4, the strength of evidence varies about when you should start treatment. It's very strong for very low levels of CD4, which shows that they've had the infection for a while. And so part of it is understanding how a clinician will respond to that. And then also saying that the reason we want to also unpack why there's variability is that it may be that we actually do need to provide greater support service. So it might be the fact that they've got patients that they can't safely get on treatment, which might be of benefit to the individual patient, because they can't get access to drug and alcohol services, or might be some other barrier in terms of mental health or other things, or even they may not have a house. They may be homeless or other things, so they may need social things. So I think it's important to understand that the data's there to have the conversation. It's not there to be punitive unless you're absolutely sure that they really... Yeah, so I think it's really about being very careful with how you use data. While I joke about having the competition, I think the competition's useful for when people say you just can't do it, and then you see innovators doing it. And it's useful to highlight that. But you've always got to be very careful, because there will always be different services with different patient profiles, with different problems. And as I said, I'm always very conscious in a clinical setting that you've got to put it back to the clinicians. But the reason you're having that conversation is because overall you want to explore why that is the case, and hopefully help them if there are systems things that they need to access, like housing or connection with fax or mental health or drug and alcohol services, to actually enable them to give optimum care to their patient. And for others it'll be personal choice, and that will always be the case. Or there may be characteristics of their population that don't want, when they're when treatment is lifelong. It's a very significant thing about choosing to go on treatment, and there'll always be people that choose not to at a particular point in time.
Okay. Other comments?
For us, it's an ongoing challenge, but the balance, I think, is the right amount of bottom up to match with the top down, and to make sure it's evidence based. And I'll give you an example. We run a thing called IDHS, So someone sitting at a reception in an office here in Bondi Junction can come up with an idea that goes all the way to the top and gets implemented as a service delivery redesign. Now that's really important because the APS4 in our organisation is the only person who has to bring together 200 products and have it make sense for you and your family. If you're sitting as a division here like I am in Canberra, I can see what I can see, but I actually don't have to translate that every day. But the right top-down too, we've had really good redesign and co-design with our policy agencies because they can see this complexity too. They can see that the constant change in government policy and adding more complexity into the system has made it nearly impossible for the APS4 to make this simple for the family to access the services. And I think probably in the past year, the clearest place I saw this happen was in our pop-ups. When we designed the pop-ups, in walked compliance, IT security, business integrity, property, and told me this is going to be our pop-up. We wanted a light and nimble service to encourage families to go digital. It looked like Starlark 13 because of all those top-down requirements. So we ripped up the plan, brought frontline staff in to sit with their colleagues, gave them 100 boxes and said, go for it, design it. And they worked out, you need this for a pram, oldies who want to sit down here, and they came up with a far better design. And the mixture between the two and the understanding, so the computer can't be in a metal box because we thought we'd have to do that for privacy. No, it doesn't really work for someone on a Zimmer frame. The combination of those two perspectives actually helped each other learn, and I just like to say that's an ongoing issue, and I think any government department, any large enterprise actually, a combination of how you mix the bottom up and the top down is actually an ongoing thing. Like
do you want to make
two comments. The first is that data just gives you your next hypothesis that you need to check. The biggest risk is people, and I present to our executive a 6-monthly update on what's happening. You don't want all of a sudden everyone to say, we're going to do something about X. I'll cautiously say, well, we're working that through. We might do some trials and see what will happen. The second is it is very difficult when you're dealing with intermediaries. A lot of our policy delivery is not just directly to someone. If you think about health is through doctors, tax is through tax practitioners, superannuation is through financial advisors. You can just add to the list. And you need to understand both the individual that you're trying to deliver services to or enable them for them to have it easier to choose, but also what's the role as the intermediary and where they are. And we're actually going to host in June, we're in June now, this year, 2 days of actually getting tax practitioners, software providers, ATO officers and taxpayers in a room to say, well, what is the future of our industry? We're launching a little ad here. Make sure you've signed up for MyGov. Because we'll be delivering our tax return processes behind MyGov this year. And so we had to understand what that is and how it's going to operate. So
I think you've just been nudged. You probably didn't notice. But that's good. Yes, a hand up over here. And just sorry, yes. We only seem to have one microphone in a very wide room. Sorry about that. You'll just have to be patient. Okay.
Hi there, my name's Troy and I work with ADAC in New South Wales Department of Home and Community Services. My question's about data within the organisation and the problems with getting good data. I'm surprised at how often the audit tools within the organisation come back with mixed results or are actually outdated and don't actually keep up to date with the policies that were actually, we adopted 2 years ago and things like that. And then nobody seems to care. So the people who care about the data think they're getting good data. The people who know about the data don't actually. I mean, you've almost got an organisation that's a very steady organisation, a very stable organisation. In that kind of a context, how do you cope with getting good data, and how do you get an organisation to value good data within the organisational structure?
Look,
okay. We can take some comments from the floor, by the way, as well. But no, let's start with the panel. But others might have some reflections on that, I suspect.
Look, I think that one of the things is that you've got to have the data has to be the right data in the right place in the right form to tell the story. And so for us, we have an authorising environment to focus on HIV. We have a strategy underpinning it. We have contracts with NGOs, and we have partners and academic partners, and we're all working as a team on this. So the data supports that discussion, and therefore it's enabling. But there are lots of times where there's heaps of data, but it's not in a form that's useful, and it's not aligning with the focus that the organisation has at that particular time. So I think data has to be within a framework of a priority or a strategic focus for the organisation to be truly valued and to be truly used. Is just my limited sort of experience. Let
me get a couple of other quick comments, and then Jim's got his hand up here on that topic, I'm assuming. So yeah, just bear with me for a minute. On the other hand, no. We'll give it to Jim anyway, so that worked. The microphone rules, clearly. That's the way it works. Jim, and then we'll come back to the panel.
I loved all of your talks, by the way. I was fascinated. I'm coming at this not as a behavioral economics guy, but more of a business analytics guy. So I'm a statistician. I've done a lot of predictive modeling. So one example that I'll talk about in my session tomorrow is building predictive models for the child support example. Can we predict people in advance who are going to go into arrears on their child support payments? And then if so, what can you do about that? But in that specific example, that's one example, 90% of any data mining project or predictive modeling project is getting the data in shape. So it might be called data wrangling, data munging, whatever you want to call it. And so there's a lot of value in data that's just been, that's been kind of ignored hitherto, this project. It's digital exhaust, maybe transactional records. In one model I built, it was amazing. We got an amazing amount of segmentation power that was valued. And later on, we decided, let's merge in some external data for that. Let's get personal credit score and see what would that add to the model we built. No marginal predictive power. On its own, it was very predictive, but no marginal predictive power, implying that all this data that had just been lying fallow in systems in this transactional format was as powerful for their application as personal credit score.
You'll save me a lot of money. Thank you for that.
Okay. No, but you see what I'm saying? But getting in that shape, that's part of, it's boring, it's grungy. Somebody has to do it. But that's part of the design too. First we've got to figure out what do we want to predict, what are we going to use these predictions for, and then we can reverse engineer what do we need. Well, okay, what do we have in our internal systems, what can we get third party and so on and so on. So that's part of the science.
I was just going to say, part of that is it's critical to actually understand what your models are doing and where your models are getting the data from.
Yes.
We had a model recently, and I said, I don't think it works.
Right.
And people were saying, yeah. So they went away and tested, and they went, you're right, Cheryl-Lea.
Yeah.
And so we had all of the data in there. It all looked beautiful, but it actually wasn't fit for purpose. And I think you need to continually go back and test what your models are doing, where your data's from, and actually have the freshness and where you get it from, all of that sort of stuff. I can't think of the right technical term now.
And the critical thinking in the domain knowledge. I mean, there's a great quote from John Case, a financial columnist for the Financial Times, he's an economist. He was diagnosing what caused the financial crash, the financial crisis. He said the people that built the models didn't understand the world.
Yes.
And the people that understood the world didn't understand the models.
Yep.
And what you just said is very, very that's a rare comment.
A perfect storm. Do you want to make any quick comments on that?
The only thing to add is we've really looked really hard. We're completely data rich and information poor. We've got so much data. Sometimes we don't even know what to do with it. But we took an office, Woodbridge. I know Logan in Queensland, pretty poor suburb. And instead of looking at the outputs we were generating or not generating in Woodbridge, we looked at the entire ecosystem of the area, and we looked at available quantitative data. We got on the ground, did surveys, action-based research, and we looked at basic ABS data about the area, and we triangulated. And we, for the first time, saw a picture we've never seen before. The first part of that picture was we have a third sector that's underutilised. We have a third sector that's not only underutilised, it's in competition with each other. And we need to figure out how we make that work better. Because when that doesn't work, we don't work because they end up on our doorstep. We found out that our absolute obsession with measuring outputs was not helping that office at all. Because if that's where we were going, they were going to continue to struggle with the 15% of customers who took over 50% of their time. Because the output fixation wasn't buying them the time to turn the tap off for the people they needed to have more time with. So we have just started a brand new way of looking at data where we have pushed away the endless spreadsheets and the Monday morning, Cheryl-Lea had these two, Monday morning reports that go over 9 tables, and started to think, can we transform the way we think about information, about our business and the way we retune our business? And little project, but my gosh, if every one of our big offices is in the same boat, we've got some big, exciting activity over the next 3 years to turn that around.
Yeah. But that's what we found in reinventing the ATO, that the program that we're doing now is that we have become obsessed with, average handling time, numbers, throughputs.
We even had the same acronyms probably.
I know, yeah. And we thought, hang on, we're actually in the re-engagement business. Right. Yeah. We're not in counting how many phone calls we've done.
I'll come back to you in just a minute. Did that answer the question? Because I'm not sure if it answered all of what I heard you say, which is how you make agencies worry that actually there's this big disconnect between the data we think we've got or need and the data we've actually got. Yeah, Did I hear that? I might have heard that incorrectly.
Yeah, I had trouble connecting the answers with my question, so maybe I asked the question badly, but yeah.
My short answer is that someone actually does care somewhere in your agency, and they're probably not as transparent. We all care about our data, and what we're finding in our organisation is that what's the worst thing you can do is people create silos around their data, that it's my data and I can't share it with anyone. And we're actually looking at changing that whole risk and intel and the data ownership. So it's actually looked at total organisation ownership in a more hub and spoke approach. And that addresses then that people do care about their data, but they don't create fiefdoms.
Presumably, though, to some extent, I'm going to come to the question here, data seems to me to be in the same category as technology to some extent, which is that senior leadership in organisations don't think it's their problem. Like it's not seen as a strategic issue.
Say that. Yeah, no, it's right up there for us.
Well, it doesn't sound like it's right up there for that agency. If I might, that's what I'm hearing. Because if it was, then I'm pushing this a bit now.
You are.
That wouldn't. No, that's fine. Because I just don't think we've quite fathomed the problem that I think you were trying to get at.
I think part of the problem is the many layers between top and bottom.
Right.
And a lot of it gets lost in the process.
All right. All right.
But you can see from the three of us on how we reacted. We really value data because that's the key.
Sure. No, understood. There was a hand up here and then a hand up over the side. Yep, I'm coming around.
She had the microphone taken away from her.
Well, it wasn't meant to go there in the first place, but it's not. We haven't ignored you. Don't panic. Don't panic. We've got time. We've got time. But thank you for your nudge. I got it, and I won't forget it. I won't forget it. Yep.
What we've heard this afternoon is very much analytics and the quantitative aspect of data. How do you remove yourselves from the human story, which I mean, two of you are definitely involved in, an ATO in terms of the providers and the person that's sitting out the back.
People cry when they talk to my staff when they help them.
And so, how do we actually provide service channels and the type of service that you're looking at when you say off the phone, online, all the rest of it, to a group of people who, in essence, have a human story?
Okay. Quick comments around that.
I'll translate that into what we're trying to do. We're trying to get the people who can help themselves to help themselves, because we can't get to the people who are vulnerable and can't help themselves as fast as we want to. And if I use Woodridge as an example, if they're going to take over 50% of your labour cost to deliver to 15% who are vulnerable and they're youth at risk, they're Indigenous, they're people who don't understand the forms, their language is not English, they're asylum seekers who have landed in the area. This is an area where there are a lot of refugees. If we're busy helping people print their income statement where they could have got it themselves, we're not going to get to those people as quickly as we need to. So for us, it's absolutely about doing the job we're in, which is human services. But we can't get to these people if the line is full of people who actually could be helping themselves. So that's the motivation for us. We're deeply motivated. In my division, all the project leads have been trained to go on the phone, and every month they go on the phone because I want them to feel the pain of our customers trying to do business in what is historically been some pretty rudimentary digital technology. It's a real struggle, right? They still have to come in and see us. They still have to ring us for some transactions. I want them to feel that. So when they sit at their desk and are reorganising and redesigning, they understand how hard it is for our staff to answer their calls for the customers to navigate our system.
Okay. Any other quick comments?
I mean, I think that from this perspective of health, is we understand, we've had a long history understanding of complexity. So a lot of our data sets are adjusted for case complexity. We have weighted activity units. Our sexual health clinics, we understand, probably will always see a very vulnerable group. And so we are very cognizant that the targets and the throughput for those needs to be take into account that. But however, part of their business is going to still be the low acuity throughput. And for us, things like printing out forms online, quick kiosks type, self-entering your data and your risk factors, doing that in a fast-track system is going to potentially make sure we've got enough resources for the more complex cases. But in the end, we do want to see really high rates of testing. Okay. So it's about balancing those.
Yeah, in the interest, just quickly. No, fine.
People want to self-help and self-manage. When I look at payment arrangements for individuals who have income tax debts, we have higher cap rates. So they don't have to get on the phone, they can get there, they set up their own plan and they can manage it. And just as Tam was saying, then we can actually spend more time helping those or finding those people who are too afraid to ring us.
Yep. One question here. See, I'm a quick learner. Eventually I get it right. One here and then one at the back of the room. Those are the three I've got next.
In Australia, how do you think that we build the political motivation and break down the silos to better link data sets between government departments, between levels of government, and between the public and private sector in order to get richer data sets to draw more insights out of it? And based on your experiences, are there any great examples or shining examples where this worked well?
Yeah.
Go right ahead, Kerry.
We've got a thing called Cheryl, actually, which is almost called
right,
the Centre for Health Record Linkage. And
you got one more.
And it basically links heaps of data sets. We've just done some work on Aboriginal identification because we think Aboriginal people's willingness to identify in administrative data sets reflects to some extent the cultural competency of the services and whether they're asking the right question. And we linked multiple data sets to attribute Aboriginality, and that data is powerful. I think that there are barriers across, particularly with access to PBS and MBS, but I think increasingly the sharing of government agencies' data. But again, it's really important that people are committed. Data can be misused if you don't understand the caveats and the limitations for how the data is sourced, whether it's controlled for. So you do need quite a multidisciplinary team with commitment across agencies to use it for the purpose it's intended to be used for, with all the caveats associated with it. So I don't think we have any technical barriers, but we've got to learn to play with it in a way that it's useful for everyone to do.
Okay, let's have a couple of. Do you want to get any
quick points?
Because these guys do a bit of sharing anyway, I guess.
We've 27 agencies we make payments for, so for very real reasons there are legislative constraints that we have around data matching. We are the custodian of the data, but of course their holdings, and PBS and MBS is one of them, are kept very separately in a secure way, and legislation protects that. So there's a government decision that needs to occur before that situation is modified, because we exist and operate under that existing legislation. The last point I make is actually an individual perspective. I think there is a ground movement in Australians to actually want to link their government information based on consent, and that they get the option to drive that, and they get the option to control that, and they get the option to, for example, if you move house, how many times do you have to tell government agencies you've moved? By the time you get to Australia Post, your licence, the bank, the ATO, Medicare, you've told us about 15 times by the time you've finished moving house. So I think there's a groundswell in Australians to want to change that, but they want it to be consent-based, and they want to drive how their
some
information. Some
degree of control. Yeah. Do you want to make any final comment?
Just another add. And I think through MyGov that will start to enable people to choose online. So you can sign up to various services, and ultimately, you can make choices around sharing data. But Centrelink and us and others actually already share data. You know, if people lodge their returns, and you've got exchange of information.
Because you guys are doing it anyway.
But I think that we just have to acknowledge that data linkage, de-identified data linkage, is probably the only way we are going to have continual evaluation of some of our programs which have got multiple dimensions across government agencies.
Yep.
We just have to accept that that's the case, and the problem is you can't have a consent-based system for that because you need sufficient sample size and not the bias introduced by consent-based. We need to protect the privacy of everyone, and that's why we need to make sure that when we're choosing those projects, they've got important weight, and that we're actually going to carry through with and use them in a continual quality improvement process. But they're very important for the long-term programs where the outcomes are like our early interventions in children and the parenting settings we put. They're not going to materialise until the kid gets to school with their AEDI index being good, potentially juvenile justice system, retention at things. So long term. And I think there is a real need for us to land the system we're going to use to evaluate those.
Support that, and there's a very good WA/South Australian project in health and data linkage that proved exactly the points you were making. But one last point, we're all government people, but I think maybe the community's moved on too. We ran, and Denise's colleagues ran, a Hackers Day in Canberra. And what it was about people coming to for the weekend to the University of Canberra and actually use free, open, out there data sets and actually develop intelligent things. And it was really interesting. We sit here and we have significant data holdings, but it's quite phenomenal how much is actually in the public domain and what people are doing with it without any sort of assistance or hindrance from any government authority. That was really interesting. I think, Martin, you've been involved in similar in Victoria.
Indeed. Now, there was a hand up here, I think, if you can just bear with me, Jack. Sorry, I think there was a hand here, and I had Adam at the back, and then we're going to probably have to call it quits at that point. So right here, I think. Yeah, the microphone is there. And then we'll end up at the back.
This is really, really quick, and it's a message for Troy from ADDIC. I'm part of your department, and I care about data.
You see why you come to these conferences? You know what? I bet you work in the same building too, don't you?
We could now, but I'm part of another arm. Because we've come together, and I'm from community services, and I've been doing some of this stuff for years. So, Troy, I'll meet you at that back door session, and we'll have a chat.
I'm beginning to feel really good. And as Tony Jones would say, I'm just going to take that as a comment. At the back, Adam, sorry, just before you might just wait for the microphone if you wouldn't mind, so everyone can hear you. And we're going to take this as our last question, so we can finish just a couple of minutes early, which is always
just a quick one.
Thanks.
The Bogan mouse is a nice creative little thing. Why a Bogan mouse, and why not a rocket or any other kind of thing communicating speed? Where does that idea come from? And the same question for you, Kerry, really is a pop-up HIV testing clinic on Oxford Street is a fantastic idea. I'm just curious where the actual ideas come from rather than the process.
Oh, the idea for the pop-up, it was actually, this goes to the fact that you need a mix of multidisciplinary team in any effective partnership, and we were lucky enough to get someone came across from a bright young thing in communications from a government agency came across, and she just created the idea of this retro caravan. And the other interesting thing is we mirrored our partners had done, ACON had done, which is an AIDS organisation, had done an ND-HIV, and they'd done it with black and just treat, prevent, test, treat, prevent, very simple, very simple. And we just mirrored it with black and white. So I think it's that partnership characteristics, but the retro caravan on Oxford Street was good, and then you'll be pleased to know that we're setting up a 2-year Oxford Street testing venue. We're just finding a commercial premises there. So yeah, it's been really positive.
Okay, terrific.
Creativity in our teams.
I'm going to wrap it up at this point with a couple of final observations, and then we'll do the usual. Thanks. One thing that's really interesting, I have to say to me, I don't know how many people noticed how often the conversation veered from data to design, which I think is basically a good thing, but it's just interesting how often we made that slip. So I think that's kind of just my very quick observation. The other quick data point, as they say, when I used to work in Cisco, no information in Cisco, just data points. But the data point that I want to share with you is a study done by UK policy think tank called Policy Exchange. And they looked at what it would, and I'm afraid I don't know the parameters of the study, so I'm quoting something that I haven't read yet, very dangerous, but I'm going to do it anyway, because I think you should go and look it up. They had a look at what it would save the United Kingdom government if they could share data across agencies that had already been voluntarily provided by £56 billion a year. That was the number. I've read it, so it must be true. Whether the study holds up, you go and find out for yourself. But it's a really interesting question. A lot of money, I suspect, is absorbed that way. And I think you've heard some very interesting reflections. Fabulous stories. We are at the end of a very long day, but you've done well. I think we've engaged an absolutely crucial part of this conversation. Can you please join me in thanking our panel? Fabulous work. Thank you so much.